The Amarna Workmen's Village. In retrospect. By Barry J. KEMP. The excavations of the Egypt Exploration Society at the Workmen's Village at El Amarna began in I-979 and were completed in 1986. The 8 seasons saw extensive investigation of the ground outside the walled village as well as limited excavation inside. A wide range of evidence has been gathered, relating to the life and economic basis of this community, with particular reference to animal keeping. Although an annual report has made available a summary of each season's results, this article offers a general survey of the village in the light of the new work in the N and sets the latter within a broader framework of research on ancient Egyptian society. The Society's excavations at El Amarna were begun on a small scale in 1979 at the Workmen's Village and have since proceeded annually. For the first 4 seasons it was enough to prepare preliminary reports for the journal, and these appeared in volumes 66, 67, and 69 for 1980, 1981, and 1983. Subsequently, the range of findings both on the ground and from research on various categories of material proved too extensive for a short illustrated journal report. Although a brief summary of the expedition's activities has continued to form part of the journal's editorial, the annual report on the season's work has been transferred to a monograph series, entitled Amarna Reports, forming part of the Society's occasional publication series. 4 volumes have so far been published, 1984, 985, 1986, and 1987. With the 1986 field season, the excavations at the Workmen's Village have ended, and it seems appropriate to return to the pages of the journal to offer a retrospective summary. In the ensuing account, each time a fresh part of the excavations is introduced, the season of excavation is given in brackets. Point 1 The general setting and approach to the village. The square-walled village and the various elements which lay immediately outside its walls occupy the sloping floor of a short south-facing valley in the low plateau which runs out from the cliffs in the middle of the Amarna plain. The full limits of the site, however, do extend further, although they take in elements which are, archaeologically, somewhat unconventional. Excavators inevitably concentrate their attention on ground-containing buildings, but one of the attractions of this site is the way that less substantial signs of human activity have survived on the desert surface, figure I. It has been known since the surveys of Petrie, Tim, and Davies too that a network of ancient roadways connected with Akhenaten city survives on the desert. Some belong to the rock tombs, some running north-south were probably to assist the regular patrolling of the desert plain by police, whilst others form local concentrations. One of these occurs at the Workmen's Village. The paths or roads always have the same appearance. A strip of desert of varying width has had its cover of small stones swept to the sides into low ridges. Some of the stretches of roadway near the village are very clear and were noted by past surveys, but others are so faint as to be properly visible only when the sunlight falls on them at an advantageous angle. When all are considered together, it can be seen that they form a virtually complete circle around the village. On the west and north the line runs close to the walled village, and on the south takes the only line possible to keep it on high ground. On the east side, however, it runs much further away and takes in a large area of plateau and valley. Within its circuit are to be found all traces of the villagers' activities except for some isolated sherd dumps on the south. The area designated Site X2 also lies outside, but, as will be discussed shortly, this was probably not created by the villagers themselves. Whether or not this encircling pathway was ever patrolled, it formed a territorial perimeter to the village, leaving ample space on the east for the development of the cemetery. That the pathway was actually seen as an effective perimeter is shown by the way it relates to Site She, I-979. Site She and the adjoining area on the west, Site X2, 1986, are probably to be understood by their relationship to this perimeter line, since they occupy the ground where it intersects the natural route to the village from the main city. The Zur area, 1982-4, occupies a corresponding position on the inside of the perimeter. The intersection was emphasized by a line of larger stones running along the perimeter between Site She itself and the easterly turn of the perimeter track. It was not a wall or even a serious obstacle, since it would have been easy to skirt around its southern end. It acted simply as a particularly prominent territorial marker. Saichi was a building with a plan which was not that of a house. It consisted of a well-built unit of 3 rooms, attached to which were other rooms in which animals, including goats, had been kept. Its position at the exact place of intersection between road and perimeter explains its function. It housed those whose job it was to guard the village and to check anyone who sought to cross the boundary. Site X2 and the Zur area should be considered together, for they appear to be complementary both in the character of their pottery and in their relationship to the boundary line at Site Xi. Site X2 is simply an irregular scatter of sherds which begins about 150 m to the west of the boundary line and then follows a linear course towards it, eventually becoming confused with the spread of sherds which have been washed by natural agencies down from the village. It is broadest at its western end, where it is probably associated with a short east-west stone alignment. A careful sampling and study of the sherds reveals an overwhelming preponderance of Canaanite amphorae and their locally made imitations. Some peripheral sherd clusters derive from the breakage of individual vessels, and the material implies on-the-spot breakage rather than the deposition of sherds broken elsewhere. The distinctiveness of the Canaanite type, which is otherwise rare both at the village and in the main city, has helped in pinpointing the other end of the trail of breakages. This is on the edge of the main city, beside a well depression which is at the closest point to the village itself. This greatly enhances the view that these amphorae, doubtless reused from some surplus government source, were the prime means of transporting water to the village, and that Site X2 was connected with the transfer of vessels from supply train to villagers. At the Zur area amphora sherds are also frequent, but are matched in number by sherds from Zurs, the colloquial Arabic word for a large pottery vessel used for storing water. The area also possessed constructions, in the form of irregularly spaced emplacements, roughly built from stones, rubble, and reused pot bases, and primarily intended to support large pottery jars, especially Zurs. Only a portion of the site, I-5 from a total of probably 28 5-meter squares, was excavated, but detailed surface planning of the remainder implies an original total of around 50 jar emplacements. This, as we shall see, is roughly the number of houses in the basic laboring part of the village. The linear sequence from well depression in the main city to Zur area is probably the scattered remains of the whole water supply operation, and it is hoped gradually, as analysis of existing data and excavation in the main city proceed, to clarify the logistics of water supply at Amarna. The villagers had at least 3 separate water requirements, for domestic use within their houses, for their animals kept in the pens on the east and southeast of the village, and for watering the plants in the small growing plots. The Zur area would have supplied all 3, and its location presumably struck a compromise amongst the various distances involved, including that from the Site Xi boundary line, and between these and the wish to position it outside the zone in which refuse was dumped. Away from this area, the perimeter track provided a clear and permanent boundary to the village's territory. That this was its main purpose, rather than actually assisting an outside agency to keep the village under observation and guard, is evident not only from the configuration around Site Xi, but from the fact that it avoided the single most advantageous observation point overlooking the whole valley, and the extramural area in particular. This is the headland which rises to the east, above the chapels. By swinging some distance to the east, it left a substantial tract of desert for the villagers' sole use, doubtless in time to be developed into a cemetery. The walled village and its houses. One of the reasons for working at Amarna is to clarify the meaning of many standard features of domestic life already recorded, so that the existing mass of data from previous excavations can be better and more confidently used. In the case of the workmen's village houses, the most important structural results, as distinct from results of analysis of material found, as yet uncompleted, pertain to the roofs and upper structures, and to the fixtures for food preparation. The excavations of I-92I and 1922 revealed about half of the interior of the village, and showed it to have consisted of similar houses arranged in a simple plan of straight north-south rows. The predictability of results from further work inside the village led the present expedition to a policy of very restricted sampling. The houses selected were Long Wall Street 6, 1979, Gate Street 8, 1985, and 9, 1986, and West Street 2/3, 1986. Whereas the village enclosure wall is constructed throughout of Nile mud bricks mixed with gravel, the standard building material in the main city, everything built outside the village was either of bricks made from locally quarried marl clay, or stone set in a mortar of the same material. The houses inside the village, however, display a mixture of all three materials. Evidently there was a surplus of Nile mud bricks provided for the enclosure wall, and these were shared out amongst the various house builders. In 3 of the 4 houses excavated, these bricks were found to have been used very selectively, often for the bottom foundation course, and for the partition wall between the middle and rear rooms. 3 The one house where none was used was West Street 2/3. The curious preference for one partition wall perhaps relates to a feature in a presumed upper story, e.g. a dais, which required additional strengthening. In the main city, the common pattern of wall preservation is that whereas the thicker walls of large houses often stand to considerable heights, the thinner walls of smaller houses and other buildings are normally only a few courses high. The location and dense construction of the workmen's village, however, led to a unique degree of preservation of walls for houses of this size. This, in turn, helped to preserve information about the original roofing and elevations of the houses. The modern robbery which had affected the contents of many of the houses hindered this aspect of the work, but some positive results were nevertheless forthcoming. The most significant came from Gate Street 8, 1985, where much of the contents of the middle room and rear room south were found undisturbed. Their roofs had been constructed from a mixture of acacia beams and tamarisk poles on which the bark had been left. In the middle room it was possible to determine that the beams had been set at intervals of roughly 70 centimeters, the average length to which the tamarisk poles had been trimmed before being laid across them. A thick layer of marl mud had then been spread over the upper surface, retaining the impressions of the wood. It is clear that this thick and heavy roof spanned the whole width of the house without the need for a central columnar support. This was not the only kind of roof construction in the various houses. Other materials survive, partly as impressions in fragments of the mud roof cover and partly as actual specimens of the substances involved. The study of these is not yet complete, but one set of data from Gate Street 8 deserves to be singled out. Mixed in with the rubble in the middle room were fragments from a second roof made with a cover of mud of a slightly different color and bearing the impressions of parallel reeds. The greatest concentration lay immediately above the lowest level of rubble, which was obviously undisturbed and in contact with the floor, and renders it unlikely that it had been introduced from an adjacent house. When this is added to observations made in the I-920s about fragments of painted plaster found high in the filling, it is a fair supposition that, in the case of Gate Street 8, the middle room possessed a second story. Such a room would have increased the roofed living space by a significant amount, and would have provided a different order of privacy and comfort from the gloomy and smoky main room below. One group of fragments of painted wall plaster found in a high position in 1921 belonged to a pilaster on which was painted the convolvulus and papyrus design basic to the New Kingdom scenes of women suckling infants. 4 This subject matter, perhaps belonging to a painted panel behind a real bed, would fit ideally into a more private upper room, which offered a setting for feminine activity. Also in the rubble, and lying as if it had fallen from high up in the eastern wall of the middle room of Gate Street 8, were the remains of a small wooden window frame and pivoting shutter. This could have lit and ventilated the upper room. 2 further sets of observations relate to the front and rear rooms of the houses. Again in Gate Street 8, rear room south, when fully cleared, was revealed as a probable bedroom, with a low dais along one side. Above the floor lay rubble from the collapsed roof. Towards the top a distinctive ashy layer spread into the rubble from the southeast corner, and in the uppermost layers, somewhat disturbed in modern times, fragments of a cylindrical oven occurred. The ash must have derived from a concentration on the roof, in one corner, and it is very tempting to postulate an upstairs oven, which would have been feasible since the standard oven was fired at only a very low temperature. 5. This conclusion would also explain the fact that ovens have been found in less than half the total number of houses excavated in the past. With regard to the front rooms, in both Gate Street 8 and 9, 1986, they were subdivided, but only by 1 meter high partition walls. The avoidance of using these partitions as roof supports is part of the evidence for thinking that some front rooms were open to the sky, serving as forecourts. The front part of Gate Street 8 also contained a small structure identified as an emplacement for a quern, of the type frequently depicted in baking/brewing scenes in funerary art and tomb models. A second example occurred in the annexa to West Street 3. In both cases the top of the plinth which supported the quern contained a layer of ash. This ties in with observations of the same kind, including patches of actual burning on the wall above, made by Pete and Woolley about constructions of identical appearance. They interpreted them as a type of oven or hearth. But what we really seem to have is evidence for an elementary practice of hygiene to reduce insect infestation around the quern, for ash and periodic burning is effective in destroying insects and eggs. These various suggestions modify the way that houses of this kind should be reconstructed. But it must be borne in mind that just as the ground plans of the houses vary a good deal in detail, so too might the arrangements at roof level. If we accept the evidence for a second story over the central room of Gate Street 8, we are not obliged to reconstruct a similar room over all the houses. In its final state the village could well have possessed quite a varied roofscape. The evidence from the recent work also makes it more profitable to analyze the occurrence of features in all of the excavated houses within the village, looking not so much for the typical house, which Pete and Woolley described reasonably well, but for the range of variation. A short summary of the results of doing this is contained in AR4, Chapter 2. A visual summary, which plots the occurrence of features as a house-by-house score, is given in Figure 2. Its purpose is to illustrate the degree of internal differentiation, reflecting the fact that although the village was planned to accommodate a set of families of common status, in actuality the circumstances of these families varied somewhat, and this was reflected in their houses, and even more so, in the chapels and other extramural constructions. The excavation of West Street 2/3, 1986, was part of a wider exploration in the southwestern corner of the village where the plan departed from the regular spacing of unit houses. The area which could have been filled by West Street houses I-3 was in fact divided into two more or less equal portions, an open area and a house, West Street 2/3, which occupied 1½ of the normal house ground plots. Both occupy ground which rises steeply from the main gateway of the village, giving it a commanding position almost like a small acropolis. Along the south side of the open space, and thus against the inside of the village enclosure wall, a line of 5 rectangular rooms had been built, the most easterly subsequent to the rest, 1985. The remainder of the area had remained open, and had gradually accumulated a deposit of organic rubbish, laid down in a series of finely divided strata. The purpose of these rooms is not fully established. The contents had been badly disturbed in modern times, but to judge from several fragmentary or complete limestone animal feeding/drinking troughs found in the loose sand fill, they could have housed animals. It is interesting to note that the house in the northwest corner of the village, West Street 23, was also an animal pen, equipped with quern emplacement, although for small animals or birds to judge from the small size of the entrance to an inner pen. A separate examination was undertaken, 1986, of the southern enclosure wall at the side of the west gate, and the equivalent portion of the north side of the village. The purpose was to check the Pete and Woolley interpretation that the western section of the village was an addition to the main part. The pattern of brickwork confirms this. They also thought that the west gate had been blocked up during the life of the village and before the build-up of rubbish in the southwest corner. This, however, was found not to have been the case. The west gate was in use throughout the life of this part of the village. Pete and Woolley went one step further, and argued that the whole western part was abandoned before the rest, citing as reasons the lack of objects, and in particular of remains of roofing. They saw the lack of roofing material as a sign that it had been carried away when this part was prematurely abandoned. The excavation of West Street 2/3 did not support this latter idea. A more plausible interpretation is that West Street was occupied by a group of families somewhat poorer than the remainder, for this seems to be reflected in structural features of the houses, see Figure 2, as well as in numbers of artifacts. The possibility that the village housed two communities will be returned to later. Utilization of the ground outside the walled village. Most of the expedition's work has been devoted to the ground which lies outside the village walls. The general spread of ancient remains was apparent from surface indications at the beginning, although excavations subsequently showed that important features extended further to the south, and southeast. This still means, however, that only the ground to the south and east of the village was utilized. Over the sector south of the village, two factors shaped the pattern of ground utilization: the hill slope to the northeast and the marl quarries on the valley floor. Since from the latter came the raw material for making the bricks from which parts of the houses and other structures were built, they must have been one of the first man-made features. The main quarry began about 35 meters south of the village main gate. Its full extent was determined partly by excavation, 1981-3, and partly by means of a resistivity survey, 1983. Three smaller quarry pits were located in the ground much closer to the village. These pits subsequently became convenient places into which the village refuse could be thrown. The smaller ones were almost completely filled in this way, and with the main quarry the northern half was filled with a great sloping bank of rubbish from dumping from the north and northwest. Because of the considerable depth of deposits, one of the pits excavated in the main quarry in I-982 reached a depth of 3 meters, as did one in Squarely 7. Several different stages in the processes of filling were clearly differentiated, providing a unique record of stratigraphy and chronology. Comments on this aspect are provided in the section below on chronology. As the pits filled up, the dumping of rubbish spread over neighboring ground. Eventually the building closest to the village gateway, Animal 350 Peruvian Nuevos, was abandoned, and its ruins came in time also to be filled with rubbish. Later still, the surface of this zone was leveled off to provide a stretch of clear ground running between the village gateway and the main chapel. It accommodated a line of T-shaped basins which in effect extended the territory of the chapels. A separate area where rubbish was dumped lay beside the east wall of the village, 1985. Again, its close proximity to one of the animal pens, Building 250, led to changes in this building's layout. The composition of the rubbish deposits varied, reflecting different origins. If these could be properly determined, they would be an important source of information on activities carried out in other parts of the site, especially within different kinds of buildings. The reason for saying this is that it was common practice regularly to clear the floors of houses, chapels and, to some extent, animal pens. Thus, very little of the debris of actual use survives in situ in houses and chapels, most was transferred anciently to the rubbish heaps. In practice, however, it is difficult to determine point of origin, and at the time of writing the integration of data from these deposits and the various groups of buildings has hardly been attempted. Nevertheless, some remarks on specific deposits will appear later in this text, in the sections on chapels and animal pens. With quarries and rubbish occupying the ground in front of the village, the building activities of the villagers were for the most part kept to a peripheral zone on the hill slopes facing west and south. This zone displays a simple order of preference: chapels on the higher slope, animal pens on the lower, with the main chapel a major exception. Since the chapels would, if the village had been occupied for longer, have come increasingly to serve the tombs which were dug in the desert to the east, their location is more likely to be a then result of preferring of rather than of we chronology. We can also consider another possible factor, that chapels and animal pens belonging to the same groups of people were also built in proximity to one another. This would explain the association between the isolated group of pens, Building 300, and chapels, 570 and 571, at the south end of the site, although it would leave the most easterly group of chapels, 532-6, without its share of farm buildings. On the other hand, it is possible that not all families were engaged in the same range of activities. The overall result of the excavations is to show that groups of households had allocated to themselves territories outside the walled village and beyond the presumably common area of rubbish dumping on the south side, territories marked by chapels, animal pens and plant beds, and individual sites in the Zur area. If texts written by the villagers had survived, these elements would doubtless have each been distinguished by a separat, e.g. H and W perhaps for chapel. All of them have in common the use of locally derived materials, informality of arrangement, and diversity of design. It is a far more natural interpretation to see them entirely as products of the villagers' own initiatives, rather than as things bestowed on the community by an outside agency of the state. The chapels, the groups of mud brick chapels excavated by Pete and Woolley, make an important contribution to our knowledge of private religious architecture in the New Kingdom. Their designs were straightforward and had a marked element of repetition, and the published reports cover them in some detail. The recent expedition discovered and excavated 3 more, the main chapel and NOS 570 and 571, but re-examined a selected number of the older ones. In 2 cases, 523 and 540/I, it was suspected that they were not chapels at all but parts of the animal farms. These will be dealt with in the next section. In the other cases, 528-3I and 556, the purpose was to check certain features not fully explained by the older work. The main chapel, 1979, 1983-4, also called Chapel 561/450, proved to be a particularly productive building, Figure 3, PL3, 2. Sheltered from the wind by having been built on a shelf cut into the hillside, the walls in some places rose to a height of I.40 m. It had also largely escaped modern robbery because, lying further down the hill than the chapels dug in 1921, its site had been covered by the spoil heaps from the older work. The monument is really a complete little temenos, or sacred enclosure, of which the chapel itself occupies more than half. The other half, 450, consists of an anexa which runs around the back of the building and includes the part labeled North Anexa. The chapel proper, 56I, is a larger version of the standard design, a sequence of 2 halls followed by a sanctuary with 3 shrines, the whole arranged symmetrically on a central axis. Low square offering tables of brick stand in the center of the floors of the inner hall and sanctuary, benches line the 2 principal walls of the outer hall. Additional to this standard arrangement is a side chapel on the north, provided with a single shrine and 2 rooms containing benches. Well-preserved architectural evidence illustrates several specific features. The principal entrance to the chapel, on the west, was flanked by a pair of upright wooden poles, the bases of which were found set in gypsum. It is tempting to reconstruct them as flagpoles of the kind regularly set in front of Egyptian temples. 7 The walls which subdivided the chapel in an east-west sequence were screen walls, rising to a height of about 1.20 m, and capped with a cavetto cornice leaving windows above. There was thus continuous intercommunication from outer hall to sanctuary in addition to the doorways. All areas inside the chapel were roofed, including the outer hall. We know this because the rubble from the mud layers covering the roofs themselves had collapsed onto the floors and had yet retained ample indications of the wood and other organic materials which they had originally covered. As with the houses inside the walled village, the cross timbers were of sufficient strength to bear the weight of the roof without needing an intermediate pier or column. Amongst the fragments were some from circular holes in the roof, white plastered on the inside and evidently intended to improve the interior lighting. The inside surfaces of the chapel proper walls, floors, and ceilings were entirely painted. Mostly this was a coating of white gypsum, but in the sanctuary, inner hall, and side chapel colored schemes of decoration had been applied. Numerous fragments of these were recovered in the rubble, and their full study and reconstruction is not yet complete. Nevertheless, their general character is apparent enough, although the preserved fragments represent only a fraction of the original painted areas. Most designs were on a yellow background, and many consisted of geometrical friezes running along the tops of scenes or elaborate floral groups or bunches of grapes. In the sanctuary, a large multicolored winged disc spread across the space above the doorway leading in from the inner hall, whilst two vultures grasping SN symbols and ostrich feather fans occupied corresponding spaces over the windows above the screen walls, I-983. In the inner hall, the long side walls had carried very formal scenes of men and women in probable offering ceremonies, accompanied by short hieroglyphic texts which gave the names and titles of the figures, and brief prayers. In one or two places the name Amen-Ra could well have occurred. The sole personal name that can be certainly identified is Sen-Nefer, and the only title that of scribe. Unfortunately, no trace was found of decoration from the insides of the shrines themselves. The main chapel is the only one in which significant quantities of painted wall plaster have been found. We must consider it likely, however, that this is a consequence of the unusual state of preservation here. The excavations of the 1920s produced a small quantity of painted plaster fragments from other chapels, and our own reclearance of Chapel 529 brought to light two small painted fragments, one from a human face and the other with a trellis and vine pattern, small in themselves, but pointers to a substantial degree of decoration. 8 The way we see the chapels now as ruins above a ground plan is perhaps a very impoverished impression of how they looked originally. The floors of the main chapel provided evidence of a behavioral kind, in two areas. The more puzzling was in the sanctuary. The surfaces of the bench-like altars as well as parts of the floors bore groups of narrow scratches or grooves, 1983. They were frequently located towards edges and corners, though not exclusively so. They did not occur in the other chapels cleared, although something not too dissimilar was found on the floors of small gypsum compartments in Building 541, see below. The latter circumstance raised the possibility that such scratches are the result of subsequent animal activity, the claw marks of a large dog, for example. The difficulty with this explanation at the main chapel is that they are found on the two levels of floor and bench top, including along the very edge of the latter, and must have been made before the walls and roof collapsed to bury these parts in rubble. The marks cannot have been the result of digging through a covering of sand, they must have been made on the surfaces as they lay exposed to the air. There is an alternative explanation. This makes them the result of human activity, from deliberately rubbing the surface with a narrow blade, perhaps to obtain dust from a sacred source for secondary use. The other behavioral evidence lay in a restricted part of the floor of the outer hall, in front of the bench against the south wall. Embedded in the mud floor were numerous tiny pieces of debris, bird and animal bones, short lengths of thread, wood shavings, seeds, etc. These were excavated in a separate operation, I-985. They probably represent debris trampled into the floor made damp and soft at this point from the proximity of a water jar. So whereas most debris from the use of the chapels was regularly swept outside, leaving the floors clean, here we have a sample fortuitously left which provides a window on what went on inside. It implies that the outer hall was used by people sitting on the benches, eating meals, and carrying out simple craft activities, such as spinning and the shaping of wooden objects. This is welcome direct evidence for the chapels having been used for more than simply occasional worship. The nature of the cult performed in the main chapel, and other chapels, was only slightly illuminated by the current work. The only obvious items of chapel furnishings were pottery vessels which had been coated with gypsum. From the outer hall also came two small painted wooden oars from a model boat. This context brings with it the implication that the model boat was probably a piece of chapel furniture, a miniature portable shrine. In fact, 9 in this connection, it is worth noting that a pottery bowl with an outline painting of a boat in black was found actually within the inner hall of the main chapel, AR 3, 103, 105, figure 7.3. It is not so easy to explain why a wooden model boat and a model steering oar were found in the 1920 OS in Housegate Street 12, CCOAI, 74, Objects 21/272 and 21/400, and oars and other parts from model boats in Longwall Street I2, IBID 85, PL 19, Figure 2, Object 2260 seconds, Main Street 2, IBID 75, Object 21/393, and Main Street 12, IBID 82, PL 19, Figure 2, Objects 2240 seconds and 2245. By far the most intriguing item, however, was the top of a wooden military standard found in the sanctuary, I-983, Figure 5. The significance of this for identifying the users of the chapel will be discussed further below, but the fact that it was found here at all suggests that the chapel sanctuary may have been seen as a suitable place for the safekeeping of the standard. The annexi on the south side of the chapel possessed a very different atmosphere. Its surfaces were not gypsum plastered, with the exception of a pair of small enclosures at the back, and on its floors lay a deposit of organic debris. Much of it was also open to the sky. Its complex of little spaces had provided food for the chapel proper, emphasizing the importance which the taking of meals had in the chapel. Animals had probably been penned in two areas, I and II, to judge from the organic floor deposits and the finding of a limestone tethering stone in the loose debris above Area 2, a room with a particularly narrow doorway. Area 3 had contained an oven, as had Area 6, which stood in a little court with a deep deposit of ashy debris on the floor. Area 9, raised up on a podium, supported a set of 5 square plots for the growing of flowers or vegetables, PL4, I. These had been made with particular care. Each plot was a square receptacle about 35 centimeters deep which had been partially filled with sand to act as a water reservoir, over which a layer of black alluvial soil had been spread. Beside them, and also on the podium, were 2 of the small rectangular enclosures, originally gypsum plastered, which resemble similar ones in some of the animal pens, and which may have been used in butchery. The description of the main chapel should really include the strip of ground in front, which ran westwards towards the main village entrance. As noted above, this had been cleared and smoothed at a time well into the village's history. On the line of the path linking the village entrance to the chapel's side entrance, a series of 6 T-shaped basins had been cut into the ground and lined with bricks and mud. Plaster marks showed that they had been filled with water on at least one occasion, and subsequently were carefully filled in with soil or mud. Not all were used simultaneously, and some were replaced by new ones. Although the T-shaped basin is a familiar element in Egyptian culture, there is no way of knowing of what particular ceremony they formed a part, or how frequently that ceremony occurred. The other chapels newly discovered by the expedition were given the numbers 570 and 57 I-983, I-984. They lay differently from the others, in that, instead of occupying the slopes of the surrounding plateau, they were built on the floor of the valley, near its center, on the edge of a low shelf which projects southwards. Perhaps they were almost the last to be built. In plan they were somewhat different from the standard design, and more irregular than most. Even so, number 571 possessed benches around the walls of the main room, and its little shrine, on a small podium, had been subdivided into 3 compartments. 11 The shrine of number 570, however, was unique. It consisted of a small square room originally covered by a brick barrel vault, which communicated with the chapel's little hall by means of a low window. Particular interest attaches to this chapel group on account of a tomb found cut into the ground beside number 570, I-984. It was empty, probably unfinished, and almost certainly never used for a burial, as distinct from having had its burial subsequently removed when the village was abandoned. Yet the adjacent chapels had seen use, as apparent from the pottery in number 571 as from patches of burning on the floors. This helps in clarifying the order of priorities involved. Chapels were built for independent use, burial and funerary cult came afterwards. The reclearance of Chapel Group 528-31, 1984, revealed that number 528 was not an independent chapel at all, but an elaborate forecourt serving the group of 3 chapels, NOS 529-3I. A small garden had lain in the center, initially provided with a T-shaped basin. 12A bench had run around the north, east, and western sides, but different from the kind used as seating inside the chapels. This one was higher, and the upper surface bore at close intervals a line of receptacles molded into the brick and mortar construction, the whole coated with gypsum plaster. It is hard to think of any purpose for these receptacles other than that of holding holy water poured from the large jar that seems originally to have stood on a projecting podium in the center. But whatever the purpose, the uniqueness of the design shows that although chapel architecture is very uniform, a variety of religious practice existed at the village, differing amongst family groups. The remaining chapel work consisted of reclearing number 537 at the far eastern end of the site, 1984, planned 1985, and number 556 in the northeastern corner of the site, 1986. The former was done simply to recover the plan for the first time, since it was omitted from the COAI report. 13 This chapel was unfinished, and so was perhaps the last one of them all. With number 556 excavation showed that the front part of the chapel consisted of an extensive roofed hall containing 2 brick pillars for the roof, wall benches, and a charcoal hearth, the whole serving not only number 556 but the adjacent number 553 as well. Along the east side ran an anexa consisting of a narrow open space containing an oven, a small garden, and a square oven/kill still filled with its last consignment of about 70 pottery bread molds. These were of 2 kinds, the normal New Kingdom cylindrical, and hemispherical with a foot. This is a most useful discovery since it must represent a complete baking or firing session. Although the chapels were, in the first instance, religious buildings, this term does not adequately cover their full role in the village's life. For people living in the tightly packed village, the chapels offered a periodic escape to a more salubrious setting. The evidence for farming, despite the bleakness of the environment and the necessity to import all water and most foodstuffs, the villagers made determined efforts at self-help. They attempted to grow plants, and they succeeded in raising animals. This was done on a belt of ground generally below the chapels, although without significant separation between them. As noted above, whilst a general zoning of agriculture and religion can be detected, the arrangement of the various elements could also reflect a subdivision of the land into plots owned by groups of families, on which they both farmed and worshipped. The first sign of attempts to grow plants, presumably vegetables, was found in 1984 beside and beneath Chapel 570. It consisted of a small group of roughly rectangular growing plots, constructed from brick edgings to contain thin beds of dark alluvial soil brought up from the Nile floodplain. The remains of others lay nearby, but were badly damaged by the building of Chapel Group 570 and 57I over part of the same area. The full limits were not determined. They could have extended further to the east, where some modern disturbance of ancient material is evident. They definitely extended northwards up onto the low hilltop, for the remains of another set of growing plots was found beneath Building 54I, 1985. However, the principal evidence for attempts at crop cultivation appeared only during the 1986 season, at a site to the east of the walled village. Part of this consisted of a set of animal pens, but on the south and west the ground had a deep cover of almost black ashy soil. This could easily have been dismissed as more village rubbish, had it not been for the fact that on one part, a block of 21 rectangular growing plots had been laid out, on the same level surface, implying that growing was also done outside the prepared beds. The black deposit extended for some distance further to the north, as is shown by patches which have been brought to the surface through modern digging. Beyond lies the northeastern group of chapels, and one of them, number 551, also had a small set of growing plots outside its front entrance, to judge from the plan in COAI, PLXXV, and CFP 107, always assuming that this was not simply a peripheral part of the area around Building 200. Buildings for animals have emerged as almost equal to the chapels in their number and ubiquity outside the village. 7 different sets have been discovered, each identified by a number: 200, 1986, 250, 1985, 300, 1985, 1986, 350, 1980, 1981. They show differences in layout, and these probably reflect differences in use as well as the results of preference or of changes in design over time. Figure 4, PLS 4, 2, V, I. The most distinctive feature is a courtyard containing, or with access to, a smaller pen. The pens can be rectangular to square, or rounded. In the latter case, they could be made by running a wall across one of the courtyard corners. Building 300, built down a steep slope, showed an interesting variant. The pens for 2 courtyards were small caves cut into the hillside. This shows a preference for total shelter, including a roof, and it is possible that simple roofs were general. The pens cannot have been very high. One example, brick built at Building 300, was probably preserved to virtually its full original height, at go 90 cm. Both pens and courts had distinctive gateways, very narrow, often about 30 centimeters, and flanked by outward projections of masonry. Those for the courts were sometimes long enough to have acted like funnels, whilst those for the pens were used to support wooden poles placed across the threshold at a height of around 5 centimeters. The best preserved example, Building 300, also showed that poles had been placed across the doorway higher up, 45 centimeters above the threshold. In several cases, too, the original top of the doorway was preserved, giving an original height of around 45 centimeters. The floors of both pens and courts were normally covered with an even layer of dark brown organic matter, rich in grain husks. The courtyards were also provided with troughs for water, carved limestone ones, cruder versions built up from rubble and plastered with gypsum, and the bases of large pottery vessels sunk in the floor. These pairs of courts and pens were sometimes served by larger courts, and also by small enclosures, carefully built of brick, with well-laid floors and all surfaces coated with gypsum. In the case of buildings 523 and 540/1, these latter elements formed the basis of separate buildings. Some uncertainty surrounds their purpose, although we must accept that it was central to animal farming. A fitting explanation is that they were butchery chambers, the gypsum plastering, which is matched only by the interiors of the chapels, being a sign of hygiene. The animal buildings belong to various phases in the village's history, and together show that animal raising was a feature of life throughout the village's existence. Impressive records of continuity were obtained from 2 sets of pens, 250 and 300. At the former, situated beside the eastern enclosure wall, rebuilding and a degree of residing seems to have been bound up with the rapid accumulation of village rubbish, PLV, I. Its proximity to the enclosure wall also provided a direct stratigraphic link with the village itself, making it very likely that the set of pens was first built shortly after the village was founded. Building 300 lay next to the main quarry, and in consequence could be linked to the important stratigraphic sequence of quarry deposits. This showed that part had been built before the last 2 major deposits, the clean sand and the upper midden layer, had formed. Another event in the history of the animal buildings was the abandonment of Building 350 in front of the village, and its partial replacement further up the hill by Building 400. This fact of continuity through all the village phases, coupled with the uniqueness of the type of building itself, is strong evidence for the same community having lived there from start to finish. It is important to identify the species of animal for which these buildings were intended. Study of the extensive collection of bones recovered mostly from the rubbish deposits reveals the significant presence of 3 largish mammals, 1983 oxen, goats, and pigs, and the choice really has to be confined to these. The first species, oxen, is easily excluded on the grounds of size. The pen doorways have very small dimensions. The choice between goat and pig brings other evidence into play. The organic soil on the floors contains a limited quantity of coprolite which has retained its original form. These bear more resemblance to those from pigs than from goats, the latter, more pellet-like, having been separately found in other parts of the village, and reveal a diet of grain, whereas analysis of a small sample of potential goat coprolites identified only green plant remains. Tests for preserved parasite eggs have also been positive, and although the egg casings, of microscopic size, have suffered change in the course of 3 millennia, tentative identifications have been made of Ascaris, a parasite which infests both man and pig. Other samples have revealed the presence of Tenia, the common tapeworm, evidently from human or possibly dog faces. Welcome confirmatory evidence of a very positive kind was provided by the identification of specimen coarse black bristles, which occur in large quantities in a great many of the deposits outside the village walls, as hog bristles, 1985. The direct evidence, therefore, points to pig rather than to goat. The structural details of the pens themselves tend to confirm this. One factor in pig breeding is the vulnerability of newly born litters of piglets. They and their sow need to be kept within their own small sheltered space, and whilst the mother will leave the sty to forage, the piglets will need to remain within their shelter. The layout and construction of the pens admirably suits the requirements of pig breeding. A study of a sample of 89 pig mandibles from the site reveals a clear pattern of slaughter midway through the first year, and throughout the second year, with few surviving beyond which is reasonable for animals raised for meat consumption. The animal pens represent a considerable expenditure of effort on the part of the villagers, and so far are without parallel in the main city at Amarna. Pig raising was evidently a serious matter. Strictly speaking, it was, as were the attempts to grow vegetables and to keep goats, an illogical activity. It added greatly to the demand for water, pigs having a particularly high water requirement. And although pigs have a natural tendency to scavenge, and the extensive rubbish dumps at the village offered plenty of scope for that, it is clear from the deposits within the pens that they were, at least for a time in their lives, fed on grain, which, like the water, had to be brought from the city. A modern balance sheet approach would query the rationale behind it, since the few prices that we have for pigs, from Deir el Medina, show them to have been sold reasonably cheaply. 14 The subject is intimately bound up with the 14 J. Jansen, Commodity Prices from the Rame SSID Period, Leiden, 1975, 177-8, 525. They were, however, more expensive than sheep and goats. 40 Barry J. KEMP JEA 73 The Amarna Workmen's Village Broader issue of the relationship between state and private sectors of the economy in ancient Egypt. The determination of the villagers to raise their own animals in unsuitable surroundings is an important pointer in itself to the limited role of the state as supplier of people's needs, leaving much room for local initiatives to broaden the economic base. Within this framework we can find a better economic balance by postulating that the villagers paid for the extra water and grain by means of a proportion of the animals that they raised, leaving the remaining livestock either for home consumption, or perhaps also for sales within the city, via the same porters who brought the village supplies. Chronology: the village has not quite the straightforward history that one would expect at Amarna. The grounds for disquiet at the idea that the village simply reflects the history of the Amarna period as generally perceived are twofold: archaeological relationships at the site, and certain categories of written and iconographic evidence. With some of the evidence it is, of course, possible that we are simply seeing differences between modern and older styles of excavation, but a proper perspective on this will have to await the results of modern excavation on a significant scale within the main city. The archaeological relationships that bear on the village's history are stratigraphic, with the exception of a piece of evidence from the house West Street 2/3, 1986. From the rubble of the front room came fragments of bricks painted with the figure of a royal personage not in the Amarna style, more likely to be Tutankhamun than any other. A close study of the bricks and plaster has shown that the painting is on a carefully prepared surface that was probably done when the house was first built. This implies that the West Street extension to the village was not built until Tutankhamun's reign. The oddness of the stratigraphy, as principally visible in the main quarry deposits, was outlined in the report in JEA 69. Subsequent work has added more detail and variations but has not significantly altered the basic picture, or brought an understanding much closer. The quarry sequence shows an accumulation of rubbish with two major interruptions. One is represented not by a deposit but by a weathering step in the quarry face at a level within the thickness of the lower organic deposit. This could be a local feature, reflecting a change in the direction from which the quarry was being filled. The other interruption is not local, but is represented by a sloping bed of clean wind-deposited sand which seems to cover the whole quarry area. The absence not only of archaeological material but also of ashy dust and chaff which inevitably accompanies active human life points strongly to the fact that the site had, at this time, been abandoned. It was during this phase that at least two buildings began to collapse, the walled courtyard beside the main quarry itself, and one of the lower courts in the animal pen group, Building 300, 1986. Subsequently, however, deposition of organic rubbish resumed, but the deposit was now of a 987 4I different and distinctive character, sloping layers of dusty or ashy sand interleaved with sloping beds of densely packed grain husks. The contrast with the wind-blown sand both below and above is so marked that we must accept that this upper organic deposit is the result of human activity at the site. The most likely kind of activity is the cleaning of the animal pens and disposal of ash from the fires used in the processing of the carcasses. It is not normal domestic rubbish, the pottery and small fines content being minimal. However, such material as was recovered is no different in style from the rest of the material from the site. Neither it nor any significant body of finds from elsewhere in the village suggest a significant occupation or use of the site following its abandonment at the end of the Amarna period. This last term, Amarna period, does, however, require some better definition provided by the local Amarna archaeology. Two datasets are available from the village: hieratic jar labels and ring bezels with royal names, of the same two kinds which underpin the chronology for the whole of Amarna. The jar labels so far studied, material from I-979 to 1982, AR2, Chapter 6, bear a similar range of dates to those found in the main city. They are spread between years 7 and 17, and years I and II, the presumption being that the latter group belongs to a successor of Akhenaten, most likely Tutankhamun. As a guide to the chronology of occupation of Amarna, however, they are probably of very limited value. They show only that after the year 2, commodities from certain official estates were no longer being sent to Amarna. But labeled and dated amphorae were not the norm. The amphorae, probably second-hand, used to transport water to the workman's village, for example, were normally left unlabeled. The ring bezels from the village, by contrast, have a profile of their own. 15 If we exclude uncertain examples but include the I-921-2 material, we find that 71% belong to Tutankhamun, as distinct from I-9% from the British excavations within the south suburb, used as the control sample for the main city. For Smenkhare, on the other hand, the figures are closely comparable, 24 and 22% respectively, whilst for Akhenaten, Nefertiti and Meritaten the proportions are reversed, in total, 5 and 37% respectively. Ring bezels are a more sensitive guide, being fragile, easily broken, and thus less subject to prolonged use. Both the absolute figures and the comparison with those from the main city imply that the occupation of the village was primarily in the late Amarna period and the reign of Tutankhamun, much of whose reign had passed before the village was abandoned for the last time. The impression is greatly strengthened by the presence of Tutankhamun bezels in the lower midden strata of the main quarry. The accumulation of the sand layer as well as of the upper midden layers had yet to take place. Interpretation of the evidence yields the following summary picture. The village was established as part of the administrative processes that accompanied the 15. The initial study of the bezels and their contexts is by I.M.E. Shaw, in ARI, ch. 9. The figures have since been modified slightly by subsequent finds of bezels, studied in AR4 by E. Shannon. 42 Barry J. KEMP JEA 73 The Amarna Workmen's Village Foundation of Amarna as a major royal city. A time in Akhenaten's reign is strongly implied by the basic character of the village, even though poorly supported by on-site evidence. During the early part of Tutankhamun's reign, perhaps when the king returned his court to Memphis, the village was abandoned. Subsequently, but still during this king's reign, it was reoccupied for a while by a community which kept up the practice of organized pig-keeping, and may even have been augmented by the building of the West Street sector in an expansion of the scope of its activities, see below. By the time of Horemheb the village had been finally abandoned. The apparent reoccupation is distinctly odd, but alternative hypotheses are harder still to support. It has broader implications, namely, that sufficient administration was left in, or returned to, the main city to provide the outside support on which the village depended, and that the end of the Amarna period may have been more complex and protracted than at present appears from other sources. Herein lies an opportunity for further investigation. For whilst it is hard to imagine that further work at the village will provide clarifying evidence, we do know from which part of the main city the village was anciently supplied. 16 One can only hope that excavation here and in other areas will enable the village record to be tied into that of the main city, and will at the same time provide relevant evidence of a less ambiguous kind. The purpose of the village Pete and Woolley, on circumstantial grounds, identified the village as the home of the tomb diggers and grave tenders of the royal city, a class of men whom for various reasons it was well to keep at a distance and under discipline, COAI, 52. This was written before there was a full awareness of the nature of the village at Deir el-Medina. In terms of location and layout it can now be seen that the two villages possess a striking similarity. As is very well known, Deir el-Medina in the Ramesside period was occupied by a community of skilled laborers and artists responsible for cutting and decorating the royal tombs at western Thebes. It is thus natural to transfer this identification to the Amarna village, and to see it occupied by people who, although their professions were indeed as envisaged by Pete and Woolley, were of higher status and greater independence. The parallel between the two sites is sufficient to make it natural to look to the written evidence from Deir el-Medina for a better understanding of how the Amarna village worked, particularly in the ways that it might have been sustained by an agency of the state. But the parallel is not so close as to imply that we are dealing with the very same community. The recent fieldwork has brought to light features the animal pens and zur area which have no counterpart at Deir el-Medina. The location of the village places strict constraints on the possible range of interpretations. For what reasons would a royal administration have created N16 during the 1986 season? The site of an ancient well with associated building was discovered just outside the eastern limits of the city, beside the wadi which has cut the southern part of the city in half. A trail of sherds from Canaanite amphorae links the well to the village. 1987-43 supplied a community in so isolated and vulnerable a place. Only two come to mind, tomb work and policing the deserts, the latter suggested by the network of desert roads created at this time. By tomb work we can include work on the south tombs, towards which the village actually faces. The matter is complicated by the existence of a second village lying further to the east, the Stone Village 7. Neither the recent excavations nor those of the I-920s discovered artifacts which help to answer the question. No quantity of stonemasons' tools, artists' trial pieces, or weapons were left behind. Fragments from a carefully gridded outline painting of a king were found in House West Street 2/3, I-986, and had been made by someone very practiced in outline draftsmanship, but it is hard to know how much weight to give it. A crucial question which has to be faced is whether the Amarna village housed the same community which, in normal times, had lived in Deir el-Medina. For this we need to know if Deir el-Medina was occupied during the Amarna period. The evidence is, however, ambiguous. Shapti figures and a coffin mentioning the Aten and Akhetaten show only that the owners were alive at this time. 18 They could have lived and died at Deir el-Medina, or at Amarna, their burials being subsequently transferred to Thebes by relatives when Amarna was abandoned. One source, however, is excluded from this interpretation. This is an inscribed chair belonging to a servant in the place of truth on the west of Akhenaten, Naki. 19 The significance of this spelling of Akhenaten city, with the inserted genitival element New York, has been clarified by work on the Karnak-related blocks. The term Akhenaten was applied in the early part of Akhenaten's reign to Thebes itself, it was never used for Amarna. 20 Here, then, is evidence for one Deir el-Medina workman definitely resident at Thebes in the Amarna period. At first sight this weakens the case for supposing that they were one and the same community. But one could always argue that this man died during the first years of Akhenaten, before the move to Amarna took place. The case for identity between the two communities rests essentially on their similar locations and general character, and especially on the similarity of their chapels. But the general utilization of the surrounding ground is very different. In particular, the scale and persistence of farming outside the village walls sets the two communities apart and makes it unlikely that they were identical. There is a further possibility. Kearney 21 cites evidence for the existence of other places which possessed a place of truth, one of them at Memphis, to which carpenters and possibly a goldsmith were attached. This proves nothing by itself, but it does broaden the basis of the discussion. Saqqara's extensive and grandly designed New Kingdom cemetery presupposes the existence of a permanent community of necropolis. 17 This is an unexcavated site, but it is clearly much smaller than the workman's village, and apparently lacks the extensive peripheral activity areas which are such a conspicuous feature of the latter. 18 Conveniently cited by J. Kearney, a community of workmen, Cairo, 1973, 51, D. Valbel, Deir el-Medina el-Epoque Ramesside, Cairo, 1985, I2. 19 Ibid 51. 20 D. Redford, The Akhenaten Temple Project I, Warminster, 1976, 60, and N 38. 21 OPCIT 63-4. 44 Barry J. Kemp JEA 73 The Amarna Workmen's Village Workers in the vicinity. Perhaps it is no coincidence that in the late 18th dynasty the Temple of Ptah at Memphis owned a large herd of pigs. 22 One problem in comparing the Amarna village with Deir el-Medina is compatibility of evidence. The proliferation by the workmen of records of themselves is a phenomenon of the Ramesside period. It has no equivalent in the 18th dynasty, when it is very difficult to identify the individuals who made up the community. 23 We do possess a limited prosopography for the Amarna village, supplied by the older and by the recent excavations. The most important source is the shed and isostele found in 1921 in Chapel 525.24. It bears the names of the family of a man named Tame, his sister, his wife, probably 4 daughters, and 1 son. None of them bears a title, except for Lady of the House in the case of the 2 women, an interesting fact in itself, given the rarity of inscribed material from the site. A wooden statue base from Chapel 529, also 1921 excavations, bears a dedicatory text from 1 Nehemiah. 25 Here a title is preserved, servant in the place. This, of course, is very close to the standard title adopted by the Deir el-Medina workman, servant in the place of truth. The only other possible personal reference, a title, found by the 1920s expedition occurs on fragments of mud plaster from one of the houses, Main Street 10.26. At the top of one column is the word herdsman, and at the top of the next the sign SN, perhaps from the word brother. 27 Gunn assumed that the word herdsman occurred in a prayer and was perhaps being used figuratively of the Aten. The layout of the inscription, however, insofar as this is visible from its very fragmentary state, better belongs to short lines of text accompanying a scene in which the main subject is one or more persons, so that herdsman is more likely to be a title. In view of the extensive animal keeping outside the village, this seems very appropriate. The recent excavations have added a little more, an occurrence on a potsherd of the name Tame, again without a title, the name Senefer and the title Scribe, not of the same person, from the main chapel wall plaster. This admittedly very limited evidence fits a community of people in which very few of the men possessed titles at all, or at least of distinction. In this they appear to have been like the pre-Amarna period community at Deir el-Medina. The classic sequences of men with the titles servant in the place of truth and draftsman and related terms begin with the reigns of Tutankhamun and Horemheb in a way that suggests that the community really was reorganized, as is brought out in a statement dated to year 7 of Horemheb. Thereafter we see a community with a much greater degree of self-consciousness as to its unique status, as well as the means to match this in material terms. Point 28. However, ostraca from western Thebes dated to the mid-18th dynasty record, not surprisingly, the activities of gangs of workmen sometimes organized in a manner similar to that of Rameside Deir 22 Urk. 4. 1797, 2, Cari, I6I, N. I2. 23 cf. Kearney, OPCIT 50-1, Valbel, OPCIT 23-6. 24 COAI, 96-7, PLXXVIII. 25 Ibid 101, Figure 15. 26 Ibid 146-7. 27 A good photograph of the key pieces is in the EES archive, negative no. I922/I87. 28 Kearney, OPCIT 41, 50-2, I0I, 124, 290, E. Bogoslovsky, ZASI 07, I980, 89 I6, Nefer and Mia are of the time of Tutankhamun, C. Keller, Jars 21, 984, I19-29, especially 1 I9, and 4. I987-45 El Medina. Point 29 We do not know if any of them actually lived in Deir el Medina itself for the reason that they seem to have lacked the pretentiousness of their Rameside successors, and have left few permanent memorials at Deir el Medina or anywhere else. They give the impression of being more a pool of semi-skilled labor not given to the assertiveness of later times. It is helpful to ask ourselves, supposing the occupants were engaged in tomb construction, what kind of work was mainly involved? The bulk of the work was the removal of soft rock to create the tomb chapels and the burial chambers, and in the case of the royal tomb, only the latter. The rock was removed partly by chipping and dumping the chips immediately outside, but where appropriate by more careful quarrying, removing the stone in small blocks for use elsewhere. As the chapels progressed, supports were left for conversion into carved columns. As soon as wall surfaces became available, one or more outline draftsmen started to lay out the wall decoration, closely followed by the sculptor who rendered the designs in relief. Sometimes the additional job of covering the wall with a thin skim of gypsum plaster was necessary before the artists went to work. Much of the tomb work was therefore done by people with laboring rather than artistic skills. The time spent by an artist within any one tomb was probably not great, and was presumably broken into several sessions as individual parts of the walls became available for decoration. Furthermore, the artists were fully conversant with the new art style and were able to lay out elaborate scenes of the life of the royal family as it could be observed in the context of the central city. There is thus a case for separating the laboring from the artistic work. If we continue to see the village as housing a pool of tomb labor, we are not obliged to include the few tomb artists amongst them. They could well have been drawn from the artists living the main city, men of higher status who also worked on royal projects. We can, of course, make a direct comparison of size of house between the largest village house, East Street I, and houses within the main city, using the index compiled by Piers Crocker. Point 30 This places East Street I below any of the houses to which names and titles are attached, including those of sculptors and builders. 31 Yet if we people the village with tomb workers at all, we only emphasize the paradox in chronology, for the nearest group of tombs, the South Tombs, was begun fairly early in Akhenaten's reign. One piece of evidence fails to fit the view that the village, like pre-Amarna period Deir el-Medina, simply accommodated a pool of relatively unskilled labor, and a scribe, mainly for necropolis work. This is the decorated top to a wooden military standard found within the sanctuary of the main chapel, figure 5. This object had been left there when the village was finally abandoned. It could be argued, CFARI, 3-4, II, that the second phase of occupation was by a different group, namely guards looking after the tombs. But the continuation of the distinctive pig-raising industry throughout the entire history of the village argues also for an identity of population. One way of explaining this is to postulate the existence of a policing unit within the village population, one whose job it was, for example, to man the checkpoint at Site Shi and to supervise the exchanges between the two groups of people, the villagers and the supply columns and other outside visitors, who used the corridor of ground now represented by Site X2 and the Zur area. It was pointed out above that West Street differs somewhat from the rest of the village in showing signs of a greater degree of poverty, and may have been built significantly later, well into the reign of Tutankhamun. It would also have appeared to be a separate entity to those who lived in the village. The main entrance to the village lay close to a major change of slope, very gently inclining from the east, sharply rising to the west. Anyone entering the village by the main gate anciently and looking left would have seen the edge of West Street 2/3 well above him, almost as if it lay on an acropolis. This sense of separation was emphasized by the rough stone walling that helped to cut off West Street from the rest of the village, and even more by the existence of the West Gateway, which allowed the occupants of West Street their own independent entrance and exit. Perhaps in this we can find an explanation for the western quarter's separate existence. If we look at the contour map of the site as a whole, in terms both of linear distance and degree of slope, the West Gate provides a favorable direct route to sites Shi and X2, the former already identified as a police post manning the natural access to the village, and overseeing the activities related to the supply of the village centered on the line between Site X2 and the Zur area. We have insufficient evidence for how many men constituted a unit of this kind. Evidence related to the Rameside army sets the smallest likely unit at 50 men 32, but this is too large for our village, since if each soldier/policeman was also a householder, they would have formed the majority of the population. The evidence from western Thebes is also not very helpful. The Medjay police numbered 60 in the time of Ramses IV, but another list comprised 24, 6 of them chiefs, whilst other records imply even fewer. 33 However, they were, as a group, not accommodated in Deir el-Medina, and this itself could form one of several ways in which the two villages differ. Cerny's evidence also implies that there was a chief for every 3 Medjay men, but other sources imply that a chief could also be a person of greater standing than this. The scenes of the chief of Medjay of Akitaten Mahu in his tomb at Amarna, number 9, certainly convey this. If West Street accommodated a police unit, and each policeman was there with his own household, a force of around 20 men is involved, with a chief in West Street 2/3. This would reduce the laboring element to around 47 households. We would then be able to explain the unequal dualism of the village. The larger, slightly more prosperous eastern sector entered via the main gateway and looked after by the occupant, the scribe of the main chapel, of East Street I, the poorer West Street sector, with its own independent gateway, looked after by the occupant, a police officer, of West Street 2/3, a person lower down the hierarchy than the owner of East Street I, though still with access to the main chapel. It is likely that this western sector was built significantly later, in Tutankhamun's reign. Did it mark a return to the village in troubled times, which now required the presence of a larger military guard than before? The overall strategy of research: the excavations at the workmen's village have had a modest share of discovery of things new. But discovery is no longer an adequate reason for field archaeology. Excavation, even on a limited scale, produces a wealth of relatively routine information, and it is the handling of this which offers the real challenge for the future. The social sciences, of which Egyptology is a somewhat peripheral branch, but a branch all the same, are built on the profiling of societies through the abstraction of patterns from large masses of near-repetitive data. Only archaeology which is directed towards this end offers anything like the proper basis for a serious study of ancient Egypt at the socio-economic level. Many will object that only texts can do this, and there would be much truth to this assertion if there were enough of them and they were geographically and socially representative. But it is now abundantly clear from the slow rate of discovery and restricted range of provenances that this is unlikely ever to be the case. Their role has to be one of illuminating primarily social and economic mechanisms, whilst leaving it to other kinds of evidence to provide the basis for judging how widely and in what proportions those mechanisms acted at different periods. 34 The isolation of the workman's village has provided a particularly valuable start at Amarna, for it defines the parameters that we can expect to recur: domestic and non-domestic architecture and a range of fittings related to domestic economy, the complex relationship between activity areas and the deposits of waste cleared from them, a far larger and more varied and informative pottery record than was ever visible from the older reports, and similarly more impressive records of other categories of finds, including cloth, basketry, and wood, as well as still only vaguely charted riches of an environmental kind. We know what one community, occupying a particular social and economic niche, left behind, and thus what occupied most of the people for most of the time. At this basic level we can cope with the evidence without knowing for certain what particular work the male heads of households did for the state as their employment, whether tomb cutting, policing, or something else. We may lament the absence of other kinds of evidence, the more valuable objects that would have established levels of absolute wealth, the written records of daily life and administration which would instantly solve the problem of why the village was there at all. But we could wait forever for these to be unearthed insignificant numbers. The way forward lies in being able to make ever broader comparisons with other communities similarly documented on the basis of what material we have. To realize this ambitious goal we have to recognize two major difficulties: the framework of study and the sheer scale of the undertaking. The former exists because we have only the most general and intuitive ideas of how to profile a society through non-written evidence. For the latter, after 8 seasons at the village we have a database, or rather, a series of them, of no small size, but in terms of the city as a whole it is minute, even on a scale that accepts that carefully planned sampling will always have to suffice. Furthermore, progress in constructing the framework of understanding is only going to come from the empirical handling of ever larger databases. For these reasons, the current work should be seen within the broader and longer-term strategy of building up sample databases of equivalent size and type which represent the whole city, and in so doing, of taking more steps along the hard road towards the goal of profiling ancient societies in a meaningful way through their archaeological evidence.